an original MCM production.
Tom?
Thank you, President Nancy. The following invocation was written actually by Pastor McAllister, and it now hangs in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Almighty God, you who are called the great umpire in this game of life, we are unsure as to what uniform we should wear. While we may be angels in spirit, in reality we are giants in pride, dodgers of responsibility and tigers in ambition. When it comes to faith, we find ourselves in the minor leagues. When it comes to good works, we strike out. When it comes to knowledge of your word, we are not even sure of the ground rules. Therefore, we are thankful for your mercy when we are in foul territory, for your forgiveness when we commit one error after another, for your uplifting spirit when we are in the pitfalls of a slump. Oh God, let our game plan be your will, and our response a sellout crowd with a standing ovation. And when our number is retired here on earth, may we head to your home base and rejoice to hear you call out, safe. In the name of him who gives the final victory to all who believe in God, amen.
Thanks, Tom, for the invocation and appropriately foreshadowing our speaker today. And now I'm going to call on our fellow Rotarian, Abby Lang, to introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you, President Nancy. It's quite nice to be here on the second day of the baseball season. Because of that, we've invited to speak to us the editor-in-chief of the Polish Review, whose name is Neal Pease. He's a professor of history at UW-Milwaukee. He's been past chair of the history department, and strangely enough, his interests include Polish and Central European history, the history of the Catholic Church and the papacy, and Eastern European Jewish history, but he also has an abiding interest in sports, particularly baseball and soccer. I hope some of you have been lucky enough to have attended or audited some of his classes in baseball. They're quite fun. And I think for that reason, he's found a way to combine both of his passions by talking to us about the Kosciuszko Reds.
Well, thank you, Avi, and thank you all for the kind invitation. There seems to be a theme going on here today. I'm not sure I can top either the invocation or the ball cap. I left mine at home. But pardon? No, that's okay. Looks better on you than it does me. But also thanks for the lunch. Brat and a beer might have been more in line with the theme for today, but we can do. As you know, yesterday was opening day for the Milwaukee Brewers, and they lost. And we may have to get used to that a little bit. But 100 years ago, Milwaukee was not a major league town, right? Because, the Braves only came here in 1953, and the Brewers started as a major league team in 1970. 100 years ago, the big team in town would have been, yes, the Milwaukee Brewers, but the minor league, American Association Brewers, but still and all, not a whole lot of Milwaukeeans would have been able to get up to Borchert Field, up on the north side, where the Brewers played. So, actually, most Milwaukee followers of baseball back then would have got their baseball from teams that looked like this. Sandlot teams, either amateur or semi-professional, meaning guys who held down day jobs during the week and then they would play for pay on Sunday afternoons. And in the early 20th century, there were scores of these teams operating on homespun diamonds all around the city. And, you know, they look kind of like this. You've got, the names of these teams are a hoot, too. The Gerber Morticians. Who wouldn't want to play for them, right? Or the West End Merchants. And, you know, sometimes, I mean, most of the guys who played for these teams, they were weekend warriors and not remarkable athletes, but some of them actually, you might have heard of them because they made it to the major leagues. For instance, the fellow circled on the left there for the Gerber Morticians, that's Kenny Keltner. And some of you will know that name. He played in the Milwaukee native, played in the major leagues for a long time. In the other picture, a little more obscure, Chet Lobbs. But, you know, some Milwaukeeans have made big careers in the majors, including probably the two best-known Milwaukee natives, and they both cut their teeth on the Milwaukee Sandlots. Tony Kubek Jr. and Al Simmons from the South Side, certainly the greatest player ever to have been born in Milwaukee. Now, the team that I want to talk about today was one of these, and they were called the Kosciuszko Reds, and they played on the south side of Milwaukee back in the early 20th century, back when the South Side was one of the foremost Polish-speaking neighborhoods in the United States. You see here photographs of the old South Side from the second decade of the 20th century, and you'll recognize some of these landmarks, I think. In the upper left, that's Mitchell Street, as it was back in the day. Down below that, that's Kosciuszko Park. And St. Joseph's Basilica is the big church in the background. And there on the right, you see the distinctive architecture of the South Side, the so-called Polish flat that dominated the areas around St. Joseph's Basilica. Now, most of the photographs that I'm going to show you, and most of the visual evidence we have of the Kosciuszko Reds actually comes from a photographic collection. It's going to be a shameless plug for my place of employ, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Our archives house the collection of Roman Kwasniewski. Yes, that's how you pronounce that name there, Roman Kwasniewski. And he was a photographer who operated on the South Side, and he was pretty much the photographer of record for Polish Americans living around Lincoln Avenue, Mitchell Avenue, that area. You see here Kwasniewski himself, and a couple of examples from his photographs. The one at the top actually shows his old photographic studio. Now, actually, if you are interested, I would recommend going online, and if you just type in, UWM Kwasniewski photographic collection, you can see the digitized. What did I do? Oh, okay. All right. Never mind. Well, you don't have to. You can just follow that, right? But you can go there and you can actually take a look at all the photographs. And some of these have been sort of gussied up in ways that you can make direct comparisons between the South Side back then and the South Side now. So, for instance, you got Mitchell Avenue, and on the inset, you see what Mitchell Avenue looked like back in, say, that's probably about 1915 or so. And framed around it is how Mitchell Avenue looks nowadays. And the results and the contrasts and the similarities are all kind of instructive. If it's for me, I'm not interested. Now, the story of the Kosciuszko Reds actually revolves around this guy, who was a pretty big deal in Milwaukee, Polish America, and his name was Louis Fons. Louis Fons was born the son of Polish immigrants on the South Side back in the 1870s, and he became, among other things, the publisher of a Polish language newspaper, but primarily a real estate developer. And by the early 20th century, he had become the head man of Fons and Company. You see on the right the building out of which he operated on 6th and Mitchell. And that is now giving you an idea of how the neighborhood has changed. It's now a Hispanic-themed clothing and notions store. But Fons developed much of the Polish south and southwest side. You see on the left a sort of map of Milwaukee neighborhoods, and on the right you see examples. First on the top, the old historic Polish neighborhood around Lincoln Avenue, around the Basilica, and that used to be one of the most densely settled urban neighborhoods in all of the United States. And Fons made his reputation by developing sort of the areas to the southwest of that. Oklahoma Avenue, Forest Home, building bungalows that predominate in that area. Actually, I'm told that that part of town came to be known as Polish Hollywood, because when Polish Americans would have made it, they could move out of their flats by the Basilica and move out to the greener lawns of Oklahoma Avenue and the like. But anyway, how had I'm getting ahead of myself. This is Louis Fons later on, towards the end of his life. He died in 1959, and this is a picture taken of him about the time that he was honored as Citizen of the Year by the local Polish National Alliance organization. But Louis Fons actually had a hometown baseball background. He had played sandlot ball himself in the later 19th century, and according to legend, he actually saved up his pennies from playing ball to get his start in real estate. So when he became the head of Fons and Company, he decided that he wanted to start his own ball team. And he named it, he founded it in 1908, and he named it after this guy. And some of you will know the name, others of you will not. That is Tadeusz Kosciuszko. It sounds like you're sneezing. But Kosciuszko was a Polish nobleman and soldier who fought for Polish independence against Russia in the 18th century. Some of you may know that Poland lost its independence in the 18th century and lived under foreign rule until the early 20th century. So Kosciuszko fought in Poland, but then at other times he came over here, and he was one of the foreign legionaries who aided the American colonists in the American Revolution, you know, sort of a counterpart to Lafayette and von Steuben and guys like that. So anyway, Kosciuszko became a sort of natural hero for two countries, Poland and the United States, and for Polish immigrants in the United States in particular. And it's no coincidence that Louis Fons founded his team and named them the Kosciuszko Reds at about the same time that neighboring Kosciuszko Park was founded. And you see there the equestrian statue of Kosciuszko that still stands in Kosciuszko Park right there on Lincoln Avenue. This is a team photograph of the Reds that was taken in 1912. There's a bit of a story behind how we know that's 1912. But one thing I will point out is all these photos are in black and white. If you were seeing this in color, you would see that, well, why were they called the Reds? because they played in bright red uniforms, right? Those uniforms you see there, they were actually dressed in red and white. And because you're already tired of hearing the sound of my voice, can anybody here explain what the significance of red and white would be to a Polish-themed team? Polish flag, Polish national colors, red and white. Yeah, see, the whole point of the Reds was that they were supposed to appeal to a sense of Polish and Polish Southside patriotism, particularly at a time when there was no Poland on the map, right? And Poles both here and in the homeland were looking towards the restoration of independence, which would come at the end of the First World War. Now, this photo actually became fairly well known. The little snippet on the left says that some of you may know that Ken Burns, the documentarian, about 20-odd years ago, he did a 9-part, 1 part for each inning, right, documentary on the history of baseball. And this photo appeared as part of the montage in one of those episodes. And on the right, you see a program that was given out at a Milwaukee Brewers game a few years ago when they were having Polish American Day. That was actually the day, I think, that they inaugurated the Polish sausage as part of the sausage race. Now, I'm proud to say that I actually had a very minor part to play in the finding out of the background of this photo, because you see this? These are all photographs from the Kosciuszko collection at UWM. And about 15 years ago, the head of the UWM archives called me in and said, "We know that you don't do real work. You just spend all your time thinking about baseball, so I've got something for you." Here in the Kosciuszko collection, we've got this series of photographs that were taken of a game played somewhere in Milwaukee back in the early 20th century. And we'd love to know what they were about, but we got no evidence of who this team was, where they were playing, what the date of this was, and what the whole occasion was. Why was Roman Kosciuszko going around taking a whole bunch of photographs of this particular game? Well, this was a challenge I was prepared to accept. And I solved it. It's not as big as finding a cure for cancer or anything like that, but it's the best I can do. So anyway, without going into the gory story behind it, you do a little historical detective work, right? You look for clues here, you look for clues there, you kind of look at the photographs, you try to figure out what you can figure out, and I solved it. This game was played on May 5th of 1912, and it was between the Kosciuszko Reds and a visiting African-American team, the Peters Union Giants, coming up from Chicago. And okay, and what it was, it turned out it was the inaugural day of the opening of the Kosciuszko Reds Stadium on the south side. Louis Fonz had decided to move his team, the Reds, into the Premier League of Sandlot baseball in the upper Midwest, the Lake Shore League, made up of teams from southeastern Wisconsin, northeastern Illinois. And so he built this stadium called Southside Park, and you see here, it was located there at what is now about 5th Street and Harrison. The street names were different then. You see Southside Park, you see St. Joseph's here, you see Lincoln Avenue there, and Fonz and Company's headquarters up there. This was a pretty big deal on the Polish South Side. And you see here, for instance, this is the throng of spectators moving towards Southside Park in preparation for the game. You see here that there was an overflow crowd. The stadium seated about 3,000 people. This was pretty big by the standards of 1912. Later on, you had some Sandlot games in Milwaukee, particularly in the Depression years, where you actually had walk-up crowds of tens of thousands of people. I think the highest recorded attendance at one of these games was about 30,000 or so back in 1935. You see here that it was an overflow crowd. You see fans seated on the outfield walls. You see them ringing the inside of, where the warning track would be. Notice, if you will, they always played these games on Sunday afternoon, 3 p.m. And all these people are dressed pretty much in their Sunday best. I'm guessing that a lot of them would have come straight from church, probably from St. Joseph's to go see the game. And again, another shot of Southside Park taken from what would be the right field area. Now, the Kosciuszkos were local Sandlot powers. Annually, they either won the championship of the Lakeshore League or they were strong contenders. You see here a banner commemorating their victory in the Lakeshore League as 1912 champions. You see here the founder and president of the team, Louis Fons, at the top. Louis Fons made sure that his name and face were closely identified with the fortunes of his popular and successful team. And here you see them holding a championship banner from the 1915 season. We're actually going to be wrapping up here pretty shortly. If you're going to ask, who are the best-known players ever to have played for the Reds? There were a couple of Milwaukee guys who started with the Reds and then sort of cracked the major leagues. None of them had careers that you would have heard of, or frankly, even I would have heard of, unless I had to look them up. But some of you may know this guy, right? How many of you know Happy Felsch? You've heard Happy Felsch, right? He's actually in many ways more notorious than famous. Happy Felsch was a Milwaukee boy. He was born here, and then in the second decade of the 20th century, he became a star outfielder for the Chicago White Sox. He was a center fielder, and he played for the White Sox World Series champions of 1917. But in 1918, Felsch got into a contract dispute with his famously stingy owner, Charles Comiskey, and he left the White Sox. Now, because the rules of baseball were that if a player left a team, he couldn't be a free agent in those days, right? No other owner would sign Felsch to a contract, so he came home. He came back to his hometown. He played out the 1918 season with the Koskys, with the Kosciuszko Reds. He probably should have stayed there because he went back to the White Sox in 1919, and what happened then, guys? Black Sox, yes. He was one of the so-called Black Sox, the members of the Chicago White Sox who, connived with gamblers to fix the World Series of 1919. And yes, they did. They did. Yes, they did. Actually, I'm reliably assured by people who know that Felsch came back to Milwaukee and ran a bar on the South Side for years, where he would cheerfully regale customers with stories about how, yeah, we did it, But anyway, He was one of the so-called 8 men out who were banned from baseball once their dalliance with gamblers was discovered. Well, the story of the Reds ends in 1919. We don't know exactly when or why, but at the end of the 1919 season, it was just quietly announced that the Kosciuszkos would no longer play and that Southside Park would be demolished. You know, by that time, I think Louis Fonz had other fish to fry, right? He had been elected to the state legislature. By that time, Poland had regained its independence, and he was very caught up in that cause of trying to support the newly born Polish state. And the Kosciuszkos just sort of faded into local legend. Now, why should we care? Why should anybody care about the story of the Kosciuszko Reds, aside from learning an interesting anecdote from the history of Polish Americans in Milwaukee, or of local sporting lore? Well, I think it might be this. You know, my principal interest in sort of trying to bring together my two interests that Avi referred to. One, my interest in Polish history and my interest in sporting history, particularly baseball, is that we think of baseball, don't we, as the most American of games. Maybe not the most popular anymore, but the one that is and historically has been most closely identified with what it means to be American, right? And there's a very close relationship of that to the story of immigration to the United States. And what do I mean by that? Some of you may know, some of you will know, that there is a very strong correlation between the history of baseball, the history of the American national pastime, and the history of immigration. Immigrants come here. They don't know anything about this country. They don't know anything about its culture, its folkways, just the way life operates. They come over here, they encounter a strange culture. And among the strangest things they encounter are American games. And the first generation that comes over here, they don't care about those games, right? Because that's the generation, they came here, but their hearts are still in the old country, right? They're the ones who want to speak the language of the old country. They're the ones who want to retain the customs of the old country. But it's the next generation, and the generation after that, the ones who are born here, who want to leave the old country behind. They want to become American. And what better way to become American than to absorb the games that the American kids are playing, or that their American friends are following? And what you see is this constant recurring history of immigrants coming over in different ways. The Irish and the Germans in the 1840s, the Poles, the Italians, the East European Jews around 1900, Spanish speakers later. And about 40 years after their parents come here, you see this recurring history of those peoples learning baseball and having Polish or German or Irish names pop up on major league rosters. The correlation is striking, consistent, and I think very instructive. You know, back around 1890, it was the Irish turn. And so you had players like McGraw and Delahanty dominating major league rosters. Now it's the turn of Spanish speakers, Asians. About this time, it was the turn of the Poles, people like Al Simmons, later people like Stan Musial. On a grassroots level, the Kosciuszko Reds, documenting the story of learning to play the rules of American life by learning America's game. Thanks very much, and I'm open for questions if you got any. Yes, sir.
How much would these players typically get paid in a game or a season?
The question was, how much would they typically get paid? That's a very good question, and it really depended on who you're talking about. Actually, in those days, when salaries at the major league level, I'm not going to be able to give you a dollar figure, right? But salaries at the major league level and the other professional levels were pretty tightly controlled. Whereas you had something like a free market operating at the Sandlot level, and you'd have strong competition between the impresarios of teams for attracting the best known talent. What I can tell you anecdotally is that in some cases I know that players chose to play for the Kosciuszko Reds when they could have signed contracts with professional teams because the pay they were getting with the Reds was better than it might have been for full-fledged pro teams. I know that's not a comprehensive answer, but you know, it was pretty competitive. You know, particularly when you're talking weekend work, right? Yes, sir, Avi.
What happened to the league?
What happened to the league? The South Shore League. It went belly up as well shortly after this. Early 1920s. My theory, and it's only a theory, you know, the evidence that you go on is like really brief snippets from the Milwaukee Sentinel of the day or whatever, and you got to kind of read into it. But the Reds shut down at about the same time as their main rivals, the Milwaukee White Sox, who operated on the north side. And my suspicion is that when the two sort of marquee Milwaukee teams folded, that sort of took the guts out of the Lakeshore League, and it just sort of fell apart. Now, there were other leagues that went on. The Lakeshore League was only like the main league of its time. You had league competitions in Milwaukee and in the area that would continue well into the 1950s. Yes, sir.
How many players were there on that team?
How many players were there on the team and how many pitchers? Good question. I'm trying to, I would guess about 15 total. And, you know, they might have only 2 or 3 pitchers. You know, one thing is that they're not playing every day. They're playing once a week. So, you know, as opposed to professional rosters where you got to throw a different pitcher out every day. You notice the fellow in the middle who's wearing the light sweater. He was a pitcher who was just signed by the Reds for that season, who had actually pitched in the professional minor leagues. One other player, he's the one next to the end on the right. He's got a dark cap. He actually played briefly in the major leagues. His name was George Dish, and he was briefly a teammate of Ty Cobb's with the Detroit Tigers. Might just mention, by the way, it's not a point of your question, but I'm going to hijack it to say, even though this is a Polish team, At this time, it's fairly early in the Kosciuszko's history, most of the players were actually Polish. If you take a look at surnames and draw conclusions from that, they became less and less Polish as time went on. As a matter of fact, most of the players were probably of German origin. This is Milwaukee, by the way. And I'm guessing that, you know, the competition to win, right? As time went on, it became less important to have Polish guys playing for you than just to make sure that the team, which still had this sort of Polish ethos, won its games no matter if the guy could speak the father's language or not. Yes, sir?
In Greenfield Park in Milwaukee, on various Sundays, you'll see reenactments of the players, the teams.
Right.
And as in talking to them, they had that baseball then had very different rules than we have today.
Yes.
As I recall was they had no umpires.
Yep.
It was considered a gentleman's game, and they kept track of the balls and strikes. And there were a couple of other rules on heading to the outfield. The outfielder could catch it before they got to the base. Not fly, just even the ground rule. They were out before they got to first.
Right. The question has to do with the fact that baseball's been around for about 150 years. It really got started around 1840, 1845, and the rules that we are familiar with now really only became sort of etched in stone at about this time, around the turn of the century. Early baseball, you'll sometimes see it referred to as vintage baseball. You'll see reenactments, or there are teams that play by these rules. In early baseball, things were quite different. Pitchers could only pitch underhand. Actually, as opposed to nowadays where you just sort of assume that the pitcher is the most important player and his job is actually to get the guy out. In the old days, the idea was, it's the pitcher's job just to sort of put the ball in play, let people hit it and run around, right? The idea that you would actually try to get the guy out would have been seen as unsporting. Almost like you're trying to throw a 94-mile fastball to your grandson or something like that, right? No, hit it like that. They had no umpire. Everybody was on their honor. That changed quickly, didn't it? If outfielders caught the ball on one bounce, you were out just as much as if you caught it on the fly. In the very earliest versions of baseball, it was almost like kickball for keeps. You could get the runner out, not necessarily by throwing the ball to a fielder so that he catches it before the runner gets to the base, but you just hit the guy with the ball. This was called plugging. And it was quickly gotten rid of. You can probably understand why. Yeah, early baseball is kind of a hoot to watch because it's kind of like the difference between watching American football and rugby. You can, I can kind of, but, why do they do that? Just close enough to be confusing, right? I don't know if there's time for one more question. Yeah? Or if there are no more questions. Yes, sir. Yes, yeah. These leagues it didn't affect at all. The question was, baseball has been described as the only legal monopoly in the United States. And that is largely true if you're talking historically, and if you're talking about the professional game. Maybe not a monopoly, but what would you call it, an oligopoly? The baseball industry has operated for years under circumstances that would not be permitted by American labor law in any other industry. Not enough time to go into it, but the origin of it is that back around 1920, there was a suit brought against the major leagues. And the Supreme Court, in a decision which is often described by legal scholars as anomalous, if not just plain nuts, ruled that since baseball was a sport and not a business, that it was not bound by either business or labor law. And thus it could get away with things regarding contracts or restrictions on competition that would not be permitted in any other industry. To a certain extent, not entirely, but to a certain extent, that was changed by the advent of free agency in the 1970s. But it still remains a fact that baseball does, whenever it's presented with a legal challenge, a serious legal challenge, it does everything it can to avoid having this go back to court for fear of having this extremely favorable precedent dating back to the 1920s that no other American sport, no other American sporting industry is permitted to operate under, NBA, NFL, you name it, before that is overturned. Okay? Thank you.
An MCM production.